Well, hello, everyone out there, and welcome back once again to another live edition of the WGSN-DB Going Solo Veterans Corner. And of course, I'm your host, retired Army First Sergeant Paul Obert. It is good to be with you again tonight. I want to thank our audience for joining us like you do. For those of you that watch us live, it's great. For those of you that don't catch us live but watch the recordings, we really appreciate you as well. All the messages and information. And thank you for the audience, because you are the ones who helped us make a list of the top 25 podcasts here in Northern Virginia to watch. So we really appreciate that. And we welcome your continued audience here in our show. Just very quickly, before we get into tonight's show, as always, I just want to mention our sponsors. Some of you may notice that Quest Jewelers, I do want to say just a quick thank you to them, because they sponsored our show for about the first 3 years we were in place. And they finally have made a change in the store. They're looking at some other things at this time, but I do want to thank them. There's their information up there for all the support they gave us. I also want again, now moving to our current sponsors, is Nationwide IT Services. NIS is a service-disabled, veteran-owned small business here in Northern Virginia, and it's owned by retired Army Warrant Officer C.K. Park and his crew. C.K. has offices all over the United States as he supports a variety of customers, both federal and private. So if your business is in need of assistance with whether it's training, IT, program management, 360-degree studies, whatever you think you might need help with, look them up, give them a call. They'll be more than happy to work with you. I also want to thank Hill and Ponton, PA, Veterans Disability Attorney in Florida. Hill and Ponton's been in business for over 30 years, and they are a veteran service organization specializing in helping veterans and their families work through the VA and navigate the bureaucracy that sometimes can be the VA, and ensure that these veterans and their families get the help and the support that they deserve. So we want to thank Hill and Ponton again for supporting us and our show. So let's move on to tonight's show. And this one I think is going to be interesting. Tonight's guest is actually Dr. Mitchell Maki. And Mitch, as he said I could call him, is actually the president and CEO of the Go for Broke National Education Center. It's a nonprofit organization that's committed to maintaining and applying the legacy of World War II Nisei veterans. Did I say that right?
You sure did. You got it,
okay.
Paul. Yes.
Yeah, I want to ask you about that in a minute too. But Dr. Maki is also he's the author of an award-winning book, Achieving the Impossible Dream: How Japanese Americans Obtained Redress. And that was a detailed case study of the passage of the 1988 Civil Liberties Act. So we're going to talk a little bit about that as well and find out how that came about. The interesting thing is he's also served on the Board of Governors and Scholarly Advisory Councils of the Japanese American National Museum and Go for Broke National Education Center. So we are really glad to have you, Mitch, Dr. Mitchell, Dr. Maki, but Mitch.
Mitch.
Yeah, it's great to have you. And I have to tell you, I know I mentioned right before the show as we were talking that I had no idea there was an organization like yours even out there. So when I found out about this and someone relayed the information, I said, oh yeah, we definitely have to get him on the show. So welcome so much, and thank you for joining us tonight.
Well, no, thank you for having me. And before we begin, I want to start off by saying to you, Paul, in particular, thank you for your service to our nation, and to all of your viewers and listeners who have served or are currently serving. Thank you very much. My father was a tech sergeant during the Korean conflict in the U.S. Army. So I greatly appreciate all that you and all the others have done for all of us.
Well, you know what? You don't mind me asking, is your father still alive?
No, unfortunately, he passed about 10 years ago, but he served during the Korean conflict, and as I mentioned, was a tech sergeant, earned a Purple Heart as well as a Silver Star. Yeah. And I grew up hearing his stories, and he was always a hero to me.
Well, I tell you what, I'm gonna ask you right here on air, and don't be embarrassed, but I think I may circle back around to you and see if we can have you back on to share your father's story with us.
Be happy to do that too.
You would, yeah, I'd love to have you on do that. We've had several children of veterans, both deceased and disabled, have come on and shared the story of their father or brother, and so we'll do that. We'll set that up.
Well, actually, Paul, it's kind of an interesting place where we could start, where if you think about, my father was a Japanese American serving in the U.S. Army. He was a tech sergeant, and he had men reporting to him. And this is during the Korean conflict, so in the early 50s, right?
Yeah.
And if you think about it here, a Japanese American soldier was in a position of authority over primarily white soldiers at that time. But only 8 years earlier, during World War II, and that's the story we're going to talk about, Japanese Americans were in a segregated unit. They weren't trusted to be fighting side by side with the non-Japanese American units, the white and the units in this case. And yet, how quickly things change. 8 years later, my father was in a place of limited but some authority over his unit, and he was responsible for his men. So I think it's a testament to our nation, as well as the armed services, how quickly we can change when the change is necessary and right.
Yeah, I mean, and I know I've seen a number of movies that have depicted Japanese veterans in World War II in the European theater.
Yep.
I know usually they had Caucasian officers for the most part, but they did have Japanese NCOs, correct? If I remember,
that is correct.
So you're right, that is a change. But I have to ask you though, these veterans are called Nisei veterans, and I understand that's a Japanese name, but how did that come about? What does that mean?
Well, Nisei simply means second generation. In Japanese, we have different words that describe the generations. Issei is the first generation. Nisei is the second generation. Sansei is the third generation. And Asian cultures tend to count generations differently than Western European cultures. So in fact, a lot of people from Europe, the immigrating generation is called the immigrants, and the first generation is the first American-born generation. Japanese counted a little bit differently. The Issei, the first generation, were the immigrant generation. The Nisei generation is the second generation to live in America, but they were the first generation that were born in America. So these soldiers were the sons of immigrants, of Japanese immigrants. All of them had been born in America and were American citizens by birth, but we called them the second generation because they were the second generation to live here.
Yeah, so I always thought it interesting, and I love military history as a career Army guy and veteran myself. And I don't want to get too far into this subject, but it was such a contrast of how Japanese Americans were put in the camp because the government was worried about sabotage. And then you turn around and you had Japanese Americans fighting in units in Europe. And I always thought that was a bit of a contrast,
Paul, you are putting your finger right on the pulse of the story that we tell. So let's jump into it. December 7th, 1941, the imperial nation of Japan attacks Pearl Harbor, and it thrusts the United States into World War II.
Yeah.
And Japanese Americans, like my grandparents and like my parents, began to wonder immediately, what would happen to us? Would we be treated like the American citizens we were? 2/3 of whom had been born here, like my parents. The other third, primarily my grandparents' generation, had lived here 30, 40, 50 years and were American by tradition and by practice. Would we be treated like the Americans we were, or would we be treated like the enemy because we shared a common ancestry?
Yeah.
Well, we got our answer about 2 months later, February 19th, 1942. President Franklin Roosevelt signs Executive Order 9066, And this creates the underpinnings by which over 120,000 individuals of Japanese ancestry on the west coast of the United States would be incarcerated in these camps that you referred to. And then about a year into this, I mean, you know, Japanese Americans lost their homes, they lost their jobs, they lost their communities, but most of all, what they lost was their sense of place at the American table of citizenship, you know. And then about a year into the incarceration, a year into being behind barbed wire, the Army, realizing that the war was going poorly in Europe and that they needed more men, decided to create a segregated unit of Japanese American soldiers. First, they started in Hawaii, where Japanese Americans weren't rounded up, and they started recruiting there. And then they recruited from the camps, first starting off asking for volunteers, and then eventually literally drafting these young men, saying, you don't have a choice. You're going to go fight for liberty and justice halfway around the world while their own families are behind barbed wire. So let me stop here for a second and imagine you're 20 years old, your family has lost everything, you're behind barbed wire, and there are guard towers with machine guns, not pointed outward to protect you, but pointed inward to control you. And then the government says to you, we want you to go and fight for liberty and justice halfway around the world. What do you think you might do?
Oh yeah, I mean, I would probably be bitter, I'm sure. Confused, bitter, you know, especially since a lot of them, they rounded up, were American citizens.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So no, I can completely understand that. Yeah.
And yet, you know, and those feelings were feelings that everyone was having. You know, how can you ask me to go and fight for liberty and justice when I've had everything taken away from me? How can you treat me like that and expect me to fight for this country? But these young men, and literally thousands of them, would eventually go off and fight in the 442nd. They knew in their heart of hearts that they were American.
Yeah.
And they also knew that as Japanese Americans, they were not trusted at that point. And if they said, no, I'm not going to go and fight, they would just be proving the hysteria and the stereotype of them as being unworthy as being true. And so many of them understood that they were fighting two battles, one against the Nazis, you know, the enemy, of course, of our nation, and the other enemy was discrimination and racism. And they would go on to become the most highly decorated unit of their size in American military history for their length of service. I mean, if you just let that sink in, right? Young men who are imprisoned behind barbed wire become the most highly decorated unit in American history.
Yeah.
Now, unfortunately, the reason why they were so highly decorated is because so many of them were awarded the Purple Heart, you know, the medal you get when you're wounded or killed. And yet the other thing is that they were awarded 8 presidential citations, and there were 21 medals of honor bestowed upon Japanese Americans. So it's an incredible military story, because we could delve into the different battles that they had to engage in, but it's also an incredible social history story about what our nation went through during that time, and then how 40 years after the war, our nation apologized for the way they had treated Japanese Americans by passing the Civil Liberties Act of 1988.
Well, I have to say, so there were approximately, I think, reading what I was reading, there were approximately 16,000 Japanese American veterans. Did I read that right?
There were actually about 33,000 Japanese American veterans, but your number is correct. The 16,000 were the ones who actually shipped out overseas.
Okay.
You know, the rest were still in basic training or had been stationed stateside or just hadn't shipped out yet. So the number who saw action both in Europe, and there were also a couple thousand that saw action in the Pacific theater with what was called the Military Intelligence Service. And these guys would serve as translators and interpreters and they were in the jungles, working side by side with the Marines, interviewing and translating the POWs that they would capture. And they would climb into caves and talk out Japanese soldiers that were holed up into these caves. So those guys did some incredibly brave things also.
Well, you know what that kind of reminds me of was the code talkers that the American Marines used over in the Pacific as well, and how the Native Americans served in a specialty in over in combat, communicating, so the Japanese couldn't understand, just like these Japanese veterans. And I can imagine that was probably challenging for them going over there, knowing that if they were captured, what the Japanese would probably do to them as well.
Yeah, they would really be seen as traitors and as people had turned against their. And there was also the possibility that they could run into a relative on the battlefield.
Oh my gosh,
because it was possible that some of them may have had a cousin or may have had a brother that went back to Japan at some earlier time, and there was a possibility of them, having to fight somebody that they would know. And there are stories of our MIS guys interviewing and translating POWs who they realized had been classmates at one time in their life because they had grown up in Japan or so forth. So, a number of just tremendous human interest stories about the challenges of war.
You know what that brings to mind? The exact same situation when I was in Desert Storm. There were some Iraqis that we captured. Some of them, one of them walked up to some of our guys and just says, "Hey man, I am so glad you guys are here. I'm an American." He came back to Iraq to visit and got caught over there. Then got pulled into Saddam's army and was out in the middle of the desert with all these Iraqi soldiers. So very, very similar type. So I know exactly what you're talking about. So I want to, we're going to take a break in just a couple of minutes, and that's when I really want to talk about your organization. But if you would, take a couple of minutes before we take our break and tell us about your book, Achieving the Impossible Dream.
Well, so, as you can imagine, the incarceration was a tremendous stressor and something that really affected the Japanese American community for decades after World War II. And in the 70s, there was a movement that began to say, let's demand an apology for what happened, and let's demand monetary redress payments. And it was referred to as the impossible dream, and that it would never happen. So that's where the book's name, Achieving the Impossible Dream, comes from. And the book is a case study of how we went from being a small, disenfranchised community that really, one of the primary feelings after World War II was a feeling of shame. That somehow we had done something wrong to bring this tremendous violation of the Constitution upon ourselves. How did we go from being this small community that didn't have a lot of political power, that felt a sense of shame, to being a community that stood up to the American Congress and reached out to President Reagan in 1988 and said, we deserve an apology and we deserve monetary reparations to go along with that, and get the U.S. House, the U.S. Senate, and the President of the United States to agree. And after the break, I'd be happy to tell you a really interesting story about how the role of the Japanese American veterans made that happen.
Okay, great. Yeah. So we are gonna take a short break right now, and then when we come back, we'll pick up with that story, and then we're going to talk a little bit about your organization, the Go for Broke National Education Center, because I want to make sure we get a chance to share with our audience what you guys are doing. So for those of you that are watching the show, hold on, and we'll be right back after we hear from our sponsors.
service of our nation, you gave everything you had. You sacrificed your comfort, your peace, and sometimes even your well-being. Over 3 decades, Hill and Ponton has helped to be a guiding light for veterans seeking their rightful disability benefits. When our heroes are in need, we are not just lawyers, we're an ally, a team who understands the struggles you faced. If you're a veteran seeking the benefits you deserve, let us stand with you on this journey, because every battle deserves a hero, and no hero should fight alone.
Living in a world filled with lunacy, it seems that stress and turmoil follow us everywhere we go. Perhaps it's gotten to the point where you wish you could turn off the distractions of daily living and have a good laugh. Well, we have a recommendation for you. Pick up a copy of The Dunce Cap, a humorous and satirical look at American society and the follies of our culture. Join the author Paul Hulbert as he takes you on a trip through the nonsensical and often ridiculous practices of our everyday lives, from political correctness and our legal system to the folly of the media and our obsession with reality television. See how these and other outrageous practices of everyday people make us a perfect cast for the next slapstick sitcom. So go ahead, you know you need it. Take a frank look at the more nonsensical side of American society and see why we are prime candidates for the stool in the corner and the dunce cap that sits on top.
All right, welcome back, everyone. And you've been watching the WGSN-DB Going Solo Veterans Corner. And our guest tonight is Dr. Mitchell Maki, who is the Go for Broke National Education Center president and CEO. And Mitch, as we were talking about before the break, you were going to share a story with us real quick, weren't you?
Okay, so during World War II, when these Japanese American soldiers were serving, there was a young sergeant named Kazuo Masuda, and he was asked, why are you fighting for a country that has imprisoned your family and kept them behind barbed wire, blah, blah, blah. And his answer, I think, is the answer that most of the soldiers would have given. And he said, because this is the only way that I know that my family can have a chance in America.
Yeah.
Right or wrong, agree with him or not, the Japanese American soldiers during World War II understood that in 1943, 44, and 45, loyalty needed to be demonstrated in blood. Yeah. So keep that in mind. Now, 40 years later, there is a bill that is working its way through the Congress, a bill that would give Japanese Americans an apology for the wrongful incarceration and would provide them with a symbolic amount of monetary redress payment. It passes the House on September 17th, 1987. So the impossible dream has taken a significant step forward. 7 months later, it passes the Senate. And we're now only one signature away. One more supporter needs to say, yes, let's make this reality. And that, of course, is the President of the United States. Yeah. And in 1988, the president was none other than Ronald Reagan, right? And there were many of us, and I have to admit I was one of them, that just thought there's no way Ronald Reagan's going to sign this bill, you know, because it just didn't seem within the sphere of things that he would support. But the thing about Ronald Reagan, right, for those of us who remember him, whether you agreed with his policies or not, most people would agree that Ronald Reagan was a great communicator. You know, he had the ability to tell stories that would touch people's hearts and move them in a certain direction. Well, the question was, what story could we tell President Reagan that would make him understand what happened during World War II on a personal level and make him want to, you know, support it? Well, let's go back to that soldier, Kazuo Masuda, who said, I'm doing this because it's the only way I know. 2 weeks after he said that, Sergeant Masuda was killed in battle, fighting for his country, the United States of America. After the war, his family is released from one of these camps, the one that was in Arizona, and they want to move back to their home in Santa Ana, California. And they're met with nothing but hate speech, racial taunts, and threats of bodily harm. And the Army realizes this is a PR fiasco, that one of its own fallen heroes, his own family, can't move back home. So they send out a contingent of Army officers to have a medal ceremony and present the Distinguished Service Cross to the Masuda family. And they did that in front of their house. Yeah. And among those officers that were there was a young captain named Ronald Reagan.
Ah,
Ronald Reagan was at that medal ceremony.
yeah.
And that night, Ronald Reagan in Santa Ana, California, addressed an audience at a United America rally. He addressed an audience, and the parents of Kazuo Masuda were in the audience. And he said, "The blood that is soaked into the sands of a beach is all of one color. America stands unique in the world, the only country not founded on race, but on an ideal, on a way. Mr. and Mrs. Masuda, for what your son, Kazuo, did, thanks." You can't script a better story than that. That story was relayed to President Reagan, and his response was, "I remember what those soldiers did for America."
Yeah.
It wasn't the only reason he signed the bill, but it helped to align the bill with his personal view of what America could be. And so Kazuo Masuda his words are even more prophetic than he thought, that this was the way he was going to make his family have a chance in America.
Yeah. So now, that's really a good story too. I mean, I'm learning so much tonight about this. So you guys now have the Go for Broke National Education Center located in LA, and I know that you have a variety of programs there. I mean, you have the center itself, the National Torchbearer Program, the Journalism Institute, the Go for Broke movement. You have legacy scholarships. Share with us a little bit here about what all you guys are doing, these veterans.
Well, Paul, first of all, thank you for doing your homework. You've really researched us well. And, first of all, we like to say that we do not think that this is a great Japanese American story. This is a great American story.
Yeah.
It's the story of the sons and daughters, because there were young women who served in the WACs and the nurse cadets, but it's the story of young men and women who were the sons and daughters of immigrants, who in one generation demonstrated the very best values of what America has to offer: courage, patriotism, service to others, in the face of discrimination, in the face of racism. So in all of our programs, we try to tell this story. We have a permanent exhibit in downtown Los Angeles.
Yeah.
We have a traveling exhibit that goes across the country and is in different places. It's currently in Boise, Idaho right now. And then, so we tell the actual World War II story, the story of the soldiers and what they did, but we put it in the context of these are the values that were demonstrated by Americans during World War II. These are the values that are needed by our nation today. And I think and I hope that your viewers and your listeners would agree that we're struggling right now as a nation, that we as a nation are divided. And I cling to the belief that most Americans are still somewhere in the middle, in the sense that we share more common ground than islands of difference, and that we believe in much the same values, of equality, of equity, of being a nation of laws. And yeah, we have different interpretations, and that's all fine and good, but we need to get away from the point of saying, because you and I disagree on something, we're now each other's enemies.
Yeah.
That's not the case. Disagreement is a part of the American tradition, and that's what democracy is based on. And we need to get back to a place where compromise and working together and finding the common good, and not listening to the extremes either on the right or the left, but working for that common ground. So you mentioned our Torchbearer group. We work with young adults from across the nation in having them learn how to talk about issues. And we don't tell people which side of the issue to take, but we say it's important for us to talk about these issues, to find where we agree and disagree, and to find that common ground, and to demonstrate courage and patriotism and service to others as we do that. So in doing so, we hope to take this history lesson, if you will, but keep it alive and apply it in our common contemporary society.
So yeah, so getting that message out is important, of course, especially with what you're supporting. But I wanted to ask you something that I guess my question when I was looking at this was your journalism institute. So what is the goal of that? I found that was a little different than what I would expect to see in an organization like this. What is the goal of that?
Let me take a step back for a second. I've been in my position 8 years,
Yeah.
and I realized that if we simply tell this story as a history lesson, we're going to die on the vine as an organization. It's an 80-year-old story going on 85 years old, and with each passing day. And when I talk to high school students about this, they say, my grandparents weren't even born then. I mean, talk about making me feel old. Their grandparents weren't even born during World War II. We're talking about their great-grandparents or maybe their great-great-grandparents. So it's ancient history to them.
Yeah.
So the question became, how do we intrigue and get the attention of young people to share this story, but do it in a way that's meaningful to them? The journalism program is just one way that we do that. We work with a local high school in the downtown Los Angeles area. It's the Downtown Magnet High School. We work with their journalism class, and we provide them with top-notch journalism exposure. We get LA Times reporters, New York Times reporters, television anchors, blah, 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 professionals to go in there and talk to them about how you do journalism. And then we also teach them the story of the Japanese American soldiers and their contribution to America. And their assignment is to take that story and in whatever way they want to do a journalistic piece about the relevance to today. So it's a way of sharing the story, but also giving them life skills and academic skills that will help them when they go on to college.
Yeah.
And not all of these kids are going to become reporters and journalists, but they're all going to know the story, and they're all going to know how to write about the story, and they're all going to know how to write about things that matter to them. So in my position, I found the challenge for me is, yes, I want to tell this story, but I've got to tell it in a way that people will want to hear it and want to use it for the good.
Yeah, that's interesting. And then it also gives those students exposure to some of the professional organizations and people in the journalism field. So I think that's pretty good. Well,
if I can give you one example of the outcome. So we had this one young student. She was a junior in high school, and she was half Mexican, half Guatemalan, born and raised here in America, right? And she went through our journalism program, which is small. And then because of the piece that she wrote, she was able to use that and get accepted into the USC, University of Southern California, journalism summer program the next year. So it was a stepping stone for her. But as she learned the story, I mean, it wasn't just about journalism for her. She really took on the story and said, wow, these guys didn't just fight for themselves. They fought for the American ideal, the American promise that, in our country, no one should be judged by their race or their religion or where they come from. And she took her father to our monument and she said, Poppy, they didn't just fight for themselves. They fought for all of us.
Yeah.
And when I heard that, I thought we hit pay dirt. Here she was moving ahead with her journalism career, which was wonderful, but she also understood the values of this story and the importance of this story for America.
Yeah, that's really something. You guys seem to be doing a lot of important work and ensuring that these veterans get the recognition that they should have. And quite frankly, this far out, I think part of the mission probably is to make sure that they're not forgotten as well.
That's so true.
Yeah, but I want to take just a few minutes before we wrap up. We have a few minutes left to talk to our audience just a little bit and make sure they know that if they go to your website, goforbroke.org. There are a lot of ways that they can support your organization. Because I was looking I noticed you guys have membership donations, you have sponsorships. People can donate vehicles like they do for a lot of other organizations. So, I saw I want to say about 6, 7, or 8 ways for people that can support the organization and donate. And, I want to encourage our audience while you're here on the air and with the website up there to go take a look at the Go for Broke National Education Center site. There's so many things that they're doing on there. And there's so many ways that you can donate and help. But I was going to ask you, if you would, to kind of share with us how the membership works.
Well, the membership is just one vehicle, as you mentioned, for people to join and to support us. There are different levels, and if they do join, then they receive different benefits like admission into our exhibit. They'll get our newsletter as well as our e-newsletter as well as our physical newsletter, and just really they become supporters of the organization.
Yeah.
One last thing I'd like to share is we're also in the middle of building a brand new building in downtown Los Angeles.
Yeah.
And this building is going to be what was intended decades ago to just be a small interpretive center of maybe 10,000 square feet. Is going to be a 330,000 5-story building that is taking up half a city block. We will be located in it. We will have about 10,000 square feet for ourselves, but there will also be what we call legacy restaurants and businesses. These are businesses that have been in the Little Tokyo area for generations, restaurants that have been in the area for generations. So it will make the area vibrant in terms of commerce. But floors 2 through 5 will house permanent, subsidized, low-income housing to help address the homelessness issue in Los Angeles. So these are people who are working, who have an income. They will be paying rent, but they will get assistance from the county government, so it's somewhat subsidized. But still, it's a way of supporting families, because half of our units will be 2-bedroom and 3-bedroom units, so that families can have an affordable place to live in downtown Los Angeles. And so we see this just as being another way of taking that go for broke spirit of our veterans, that spirit of courage and patriotism and service to others, and putting it into play today in Los Angeles.
Yeah, that's really impressive. They just here in our area, they just opened up a 3-story, I don't know the square footage, but it's the Museum of the United States Army. And it's impressive. Yeah. And so when you talk about your building going up there and all that you're going to do for it, I just have one question though before we get into the close of the show. You were talking about somebody who donates, his membership and things like that. They can get free admission. I'm wondering, does that also include your memorial over in Japan? You guys don't you guys have a memorial over there, or
No, we don't have.
Okay. I thought I was reading somewhere that you guys had one in Japan as well. So.
Oh, if you can find that article, please share it with me. Maybe I don't know about it.
Yeah, I'll take a look again.
Okay.
So, but no, that's okay. Well, Mitch, I got to tell you, it's been great having you on the show to share this story. And, this is all new to me, so I'm learning so much. And I'm sure our audience is too. And, I want to thank you for what you're doing with this group. But I want to ask you one more question before we close the show. If you had one message to share with the audience, what would it be? Did your picture freeze on me, or
No, I'm deep in thought.
I wasn't sure.
Right. I have so many messages that I would want to say, but that I think what it comes down to in my heart of hearts is that we are a nation of many different people who have come to this country, and that diversity makes us stronger. And this is one story. The story we tell is one story of the strength of that diversity, and that we as a nation need to cherish that and cherish, and I know I sound like a broken record with this, but cherish the common ground that we share, that we are a beacon for the world, and it's important that we not forget that.
Yeah, no, that's actually a very good point. Very good point, especially, today with all the things going on. I just want to thank you so much for taking the time to come on. And for the audience out there, you need to go take a look at this website and see what all they have and what all they're doing out there. There's so much there. GoForBroke.org, there it is on the screen. And go on there and take a look at the various support mechanisms that they have in place on the website as well. So please do that. And Mitch, like I said, I'm going to circle around back to you because I'd love to have you come back on and share your father's story.
I would love to do that. And certainly there were so many stories I didn't even get to share today.
Yeah.
So I would be happy to come back anytime.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for appearing on the show, and we look forward to having you back again. And
thank you, Paul.
And for our audience out there, of course, as we share information at the end of each show that we try to at least hope that's going to be useful to you and helpful, I'm going to continue on for tonight's show, and we're going to put up in our resource page the GoForBroke.org website information and the information about the National Education Center. You'll find it on our resource page on our website where my show is. Hope you'll get a chance to visit it if you don't get a chance to do it this evening or in the next day or so. Take a look, see what you can do to help this organization because they're doing great work. So thank you for spending some time with us tonight. You've been watching the WGSN-DB Going Solo Veterans Show on the newstreamingnetwork.com. And for your veterans out there, as always, we want to thank you and your families for your service and support. And we hope to see all of you on our next show.